Hello and welcome to this short overview of the Cold War. I'm going to briefly touch on the main political topics and events here. Please note I'll be doing a separate presentation on the Vietnam War and will only barely touch on it in this lecture. So at the start of the Cold War, you have essentially two sides, and those two sides are going to persist throughout the entirety of the Cold War until it ends in 1991. One is the Soviet side, led by the Soviet Union at this point, Joseph Stalin, and the other I'll sometimes refer to as the West, sometimes NATO, sometimes as the Allies, in which case I'm talking mostly about the United States, Great Britain, and France. There are other participating nations in this, but those are the two main protagonists at this point. Both sides possessed what I would call a trump card or a sort of ace up their sleeve in 1945, 1946, as World War II comes to the end. The Red Army just has so much superior numbers, and by Red Army, I'm referring to the Soviet Army or the USSR's army that controlled by Joseph Stalin. At the end of the war, they have so many tanks and troops in Europe that most military thinkers believe that if Stalin wanted to, he'd be able to sweep across Western Europe, taking France, potentially even Spain, before anybody would have the ability to do anything about it. However, the United States possessed the great deterrent in this age. The United States, after World War II, was the only nation on Earth to possess the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb had only been used twice up to this point, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to end the war with Japan. USSR, the Soviet Union, did not have the atomic bomb at the end of World War II. So the fact that the United States had it was very important. Now, at the close of World War II, the Allies, Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union were determined not to repeat the mistakes of the last World War, World War I. Germany would not be a threat in the future. In order to do this, what they did was they divided Germany in half. There'd be an East Germany run by the Soviets, and there'd be West Germany run by the Allies. Likewise, Berlin, even though it was within East Germany, so it's on the Soviet side, would be split in two as well, having a Soviet half, East Berlin, and West Berlin, an Allied half. The official policy of the United States after the close of World War II is a strategy that's called containment. Many people believe that the Soviet Union was a political force committed fanatically to the belief that with the US, there can be no sort of like agreement between the parties. The idea is that both sides are sort of settling into this stagnant period of constant vigilance and peace, but a peace that is relatively uneasy. So, what the United States decides to do is they're going to work to make sure that where communism presently exists, that's where it stays. The United States is going to follow a policy that is devoted not towards attacking the Soviet Union directly, but towards making sure that communism and Soviet influence does not spread further than it is right now. That's what containment is. So it's going to be a series of what we call proxy wars, or wars fought in different countries that don't necessarily involve the United States or the Soviet Union directly in many cases, but involve one of those two sides supporting a faction within the country. The Soviets will oftentimes just support dictators and groups who promise to become communists. The United States will do the exact same thing, except supporting people who promise they will be capitalist. So the first major event to talk about in the Cold War is the Berlin airlift. Even though, as I mentioned, Berlin was located entirely within the Soviet part of the country, it was actually about 100 miles from the border of West Germany. Pursuant to the Yalta and Potsdam agreements, the German capital had been split into two sectors, but the Soviet Union was really dissatisfied with this arrangement. Twice in recent memory, they had been invaded by Germany and borne the brunt of the casualties. They had no interest in promoting that country's unification, but it seemed like that was the end goal for the United States, Great Britain, and France. And so they tried to essentially starve out the American, British, and French side from Berlin. On June the 24th, 1948, so only about 3 years after the end of World War II, the Soviet Union announced that the highway that connects Western Germany to Berlin, which is called the Autobahn, by the way, would be closed indefinitely, quote unquote, for repairs. And then they just halted all road traffic from west to east and barred all barge and rail traffic entering West Berlin, thus blockading West Berlin and preventing any food or resources from getting in. Now, as far as the Western Allies were concerned, withdrawal was absolutely not an option. They weren't going to do it. So instead, what they decided was that the Allies would supply West Berlin from the air. Allied cargo planes would use open air corridors over Soviet occupied zones to deliver food, fuel, and other goods to the people who lived in the western part of the city. This became known in American parlance as the Berlin Airlift. It was supposed to be a short term measure, but then, as the Soviets refused to lift the blockade, it went on for almost an entire year. In the end, the Allies were able to deliver successfully by air 5,000 tons of supplies to West Berlin every single day. That was in the beginning. By the end, it was about 8,000 tons of supplies per day. All in all, over a course of about a year, the Allies carried about 2.3 million tons of cargo in and kept West Berlin afloat, until which point the Soviets finally dropped the blockade. Uh, I do want to talk a little bit, though this is going to span a long time period, but it's important to understand that the space race is a crucial part of the Cold War. Space exploration was actually another dramatic arena for Cold War competition. The Soviet Union gets off to the best start. On October the 4th, 1957, Soviet R-7, which was an intercontinental ballistic missile, so these are missiles that can go over continents, launched the first ever artificial satellite into the world called Sputnik. Sputnik is actually Russian for travel companion. This was the first ever man-made object to be placed into the Earth's orbit. Sputnik's launch actually came as a total surprise to the West. Most Americans just assumed that the Soviets didn't have the technology capable of doing something like this. In the United States, space was seen as the next great frontier, a logical sort of extension of the frontier ideals of American history, and they didn't want to lose too much ground to the Soviets. So in 1958, the United States launches its own satellite, Explorer 1, designed by the US Army. And now that begins what's called the space race. This is all done initially under President Dwight D. Eisenhower. And he is the president who signs a public order that creates the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, otherwise, of course, known today as NASA. NASA is a federal agency dedicated to space exploration, as well as different programs seeking to exploit the military potential of space. But the Soviets remained ahead and launched the first man into space in April 1961. That May, though, Alan Shepard became the first American man into space. So this is in 1961 at this point, under the control of President John F. Kennedy, who served as president from 1961 until November 1963, when he would be assassinated. But he made the claim that the US would land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And his prediction would come true when, on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong of NASA's Apollo 11 mission became the first man to set foot on the moon, effectively winning the space race for the Americans. The Korean War is another aspect of the Cold War, something that really wasn't talked about very much years ago, but is gaining a little bit more traction. In some older history textbooks, you won't even see the Korean War referred to as a war. But the Korean War began on June 25th, 1950, when North Korean soldiers from the North Korean People's Army, poured across the 38th parallel, which was the border between the Soviet backed Democratic People's Republic of Korea to the north and the pro Western Republic of Korea to the south. This invasion was actually the first military action of the Cold War. By July, American troops had entered the war on South Korea's behalf. As far as American officials were concerned, it was a war against the forces of international communism itself. After some back and forth fighting, Across the 38th parallel, the fighting stalled and casualties mounted with nothing to show for it. American officials were working anxiously behind the scenes to try to get some sort of an armistice with the North Koreans, some sort of a temporary peace. They were afraid that if this war got any wider, it could draw in China, which is true. China is going to get involved in the war, or maybe even the Soviet Union itself, leading to World War III. But in 1953, the Korean War came to an end after about 5 million soldier and civilian casualties. It's oftentimes referred to as the Forgotten War in the United States. Technically, there is not a lasting peace treaty even today between North Korea and South Korea. They have what's called an armistice or a ceasefire, which just means that they're not fighting at the moment. And the 38th parallel, which refers to the space on the ground, right, that divides North Korea and South Korea, that's still the border even to this day today. A couple of other things that I wanted to touch on early on is that we have two sides to this conflict. And I told you that the major participants were the United States on one side with Britain and France, plus a bunch of other individuals. They form what's called the North American Treaty Organization, or NATO for short. NATO is this sort of allied way of banding together different nations to present a united front to the Soviet Union. These are all Western pro-democracy style governments. Crucially, the most important part of NATO is that an attack on any NATO nation by the Soviet Union would be seen as an attack on every NATO nation. So it's essentially a mutual defense pact, and that's what exists today. You hear about it sometimes in the news with regard to the war in Ukraine, because Poland is a NATO member. And were Russia today to attack Poland, that would potentially draw in all the other NATO countries, including Britain, France, and of course the United States, Germany as well now. On the other side of the coin, you had all these little Soviet satellite states. Back then, this is places like Yugoslavia, which doesn't exist anymore, Hungary, Belarus, all these other territories in Central Europe, plus a bunch of Muslim majority nations in Asia, were also allied with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union called that the Warsaw Pact. So they had their sphere of influence on the other side, which actually included Poland at this point, which is going to end up flipping later on, but hasn't as of yet. So you have Warsaw Pact nations who support the Soviet Union and NATO nations that support the West and the United States. Famously, Winston Churchill said in a speech, the sort of line that's being drawn in Central Europe between the Soviet East and the Democratic West is referred to as the Iron Curtain that goes down between those two sides. Now, as I said before, I am really not going to talk a lot about the Vietnam War here, but the only thing I want you to understand is that the Vietnam War is part of this emerging theory that's referred to as the domino theory, which is after China became communist, the fear was that communism was going to continue to spread in Southeast Asia, which is no longer being ruled by a lot of old imperial European powers. Vietnam used to be controlled by France. And so when a civil war essentially breaks out in Vietnam between what are allegedly pro-democratic forces and, again, sort of allegedly Soviet-led forces, the United States gets involved because the domino theory is every single nation that falls is going to trigger this sort of wave and ripple-like effect. Like all the dominoes are going to fall down and everything is going to turn Soviet. And so I'll talk more about the Vietnam War in great detail later on, but just know for right now that it is part of this domino theory. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 was a failed attack launched by the CIA during President John F. Kennedy's administration to try to take control of Cuba. Why? Because Cuba, since 1959, had been quote unquote communist and led by Fidel Castro, who's pictured there in the center of the image that you see on the screen. On April 17th, 1961, the CIA launched what the leaders, at least in the CIA, thought would be a definitive and easy win, a full-scale invasion of Cuba by about 1,400 American-trained Cubans. These are people who had fled their homes when Castro took over, but it was an absolute disaster. There wasn't any air support for the invaders. The invaders were vastly outnumbered, and they had to surrender after less than 24 hours of fighting. It was a huge embarrassment for the United States of America. The bigger deal, though, is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which occurred the next year in 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis is probably as close as we have come to nuclear annihilation and World War III, at least to date. In 1962, an American spy plane took photographs of a missile base that was being constructed in Cuba, a missile base for the purposes of firing a Soviet nuclear missile. Back then, neither country had the capacity of launching a nuclear missile from, say, the United States to Russia or vice versa. The Soviet Union was nervous because the United States had a series of missile bases of its own in modern day Turkey, and they saw the deployment of missiles in Cuba as a way to level the playing field. Of course, this was also part of the hostile relationship between the United States and Cuba. So, what ends up happening is that Nikolai Khrushchev, who is the Soviet Union leader at this point, decides that he's going to send missiles to the United States. Kennedy has to decide what he's going to do about this. There are some people who are advocating in the administration that it is now time to simply launch a preemptive assault on the Soviet Union, launch the missiles that are all in Turkey, and try to take them out before we put ourselves in a worse position. Kennedy decides not to do that. Instead, he decides he's going to use the US Navy to blockade the island and prevent additional missiles and materials from being delivered to Cuba from Russia, and that he would also demand that all the present missiles be removed. This gets really tense. At one point, Soviet ships bearing nuclear missiles sail right up to the blockade, but they don't force it. A deal is what solves the situation in the end. The Soviets remove all the missiles from Cuba. The US agrees that it's not going to invade Cuba again in the future. And the US agrees that it's going to remove all of its missiles from Turkey. That's actually a private side deal that the United States doesn't announce because the public might have been too upset about it. Now, Richard Nixon plays also a huge part in the Cold War. He's president in the mid 70s. He tries a new approach. So instead of viewing the world as like necessarily hostile, a sum zero game, bipolar place, he decides let's try to use diplomacy rather than power to bring an end to the Cold War. To that end, he actually encouraged the United Nations to recognize communist Chinese government. That's a picture of him on a famous trip to the Chinese government in 1972. And in that year, he starts to establish diplomatic relations with Beijing. At the same time, Nixon adopts this policy that he calls détente, which means relaxation. The policy of détente is to try to engage in more friendly relations with the Soviet Union in the hopes of trying to bring the boiling level of the situation down a little bit. And it works. In 1972, Nixon and the Soviet premier, Brezhnev is his name at the time, signed the first what's called Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT. This prohibits the manufacture of nuclear missiles by both sides and actually takes a major step towards reducing decades-old threat of nuclear war. There's going to be a series of these SALT treaties, and we won't go into all of them, but the first one was under Richard Nixon. The Cold War then heats up again under President Ronald Reagan. He believed that the spread of communism anywhere threatened the freedom everywhere. As a result, he worked to provide financial and military aid to anti-communist governments and insurgencies around the world. This policy, particularly as it was applied in developing world places like Grenada and El Salvador, so a lot of South and Central American countries, was known as the Reagan Doctrine. So the Reagan Doctrine is really about trying to provide mostly financial aid, some military aid. There's the Iran-Contra scandal, which I'll get into in a later lecture, where we're giving weapons to different insurgents in Nicaragua. But by and large, what the Reagan Doctrine was about was using financial resources of the United States to try to stem the spread of communism. It didn't really matter because even as Reagan fought communism in Central America, the Soviet Union was falling apart. In response to severe economic problems and growing political fervor in the USSR, the new premier, the leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, took office in 1985, and he introduced two policies that redefined Russia's relationship to the rest of the world. These are Russian things, so we're not really going to focus on them because we're mostly interested in the United States side, but just so you know what they are, there are two policies. One is called glasnost, which means political openness, and the other is perestroika, which is economic reform. So the Soviet Union is going to move away from its one party rule a little bit and engage in more elections, while at the same time moving away from a command based economy and more towards, I'm not going to say a capitalist, but a more open economy. Soviet Union and Eastern Europe was simply falling apart. In 1989, Ukraine broke away from the Soviet Union, and at that point, all the dominoes just kind of fell at the same time, and the USSR disintegrated. In November of that year, 1989, the Berlin Wall, which was the most visible symbol of the Cold War, finally came down. In fact, just 2 years before, Reagan had gone to Berlin and had challenged the Soviet premier at the time at a place called the Brandenburg Gate, which is actually pictured right there in the image behind you, telling him, quote, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. By 1991, the Soviet Union had fallen apart and the Cold War was over.